and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone. And welcome back to another video chat organized around the book A Brief History of Economic Thought from the Mercantilists to the Post-Keynesians, published by Edward Elgar. To celebrate the book, which will be published in July 2022, I wanted to do something different, and I thought of sitting down with each of the authors to discuss their chapter and their contribution to the book. Today's guests are Suranjana Nabar-Bhaduri and Matías Vernengo. Suranjana is an assistant professor of economics at Frostburg State University in Maryland. Her areas of specialization include macroeconomics, development economics, international economics, and the history of economic thought. Her research areas have included the effects of economic liberalization on productivity and employment in the Indian economy, factors driving the reduction of the balance of payments constraint in developing countries, the financial fragility of persistent external imbalances, evaluating alternative growth trajectories and their implications for development and comparative analyses of the growth trajectories of China and India in the context of the global economy. Her more recent research has focused on the problem of informal employment in the Indian economy and possible policies to address it, and on the economic implications of the COVID-19 economic crisis for economic policy and the role of the Fed in the US economy. Our co-author for this paper is Matías Vernengo, who's a full professor at Bucknell University. He was formerly senior research manager at the Central Bank of Argentina, associate professor of economics at the University of Utah, and assistant professor at Kalamazoo College in Michigan, and the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He has been an external consultant to several United Nations organizations like the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the International Labor Organization, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and the United Nations Development Program. He specializes in macroeconomic issues for developing countries, in particular Latin America, international political economy, and the history of economic ideas. He is also the co-editor of the Review of Keynesian Economics and co-editor-in-chief of the New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics. Well, welcome both, and thank you for joining me, and thank you for contributing to this book.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, and you're welcome. Your chapter is on the classical periods, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. We have a separate chapter on Karl Marx, but these authors date back a couple of hundred years ago. So why would students today care about what was written a few hundred years ago?
Well, I would say that classical authors discussed economic issues that remain very relevant to the contemporary real world, such as the conflictive nature of distribution, how economic crises can arise, and what influences a country's ability to grow. And their writings on these issues do help to provide a better understanding of them, and also how these issues intertwine with the political and the social aspects of a society. Additionally, I would also note that classical authors were concerned with objective, quantifiable data to gain more insights into these issues, which is very important because over the years, economics as a discipline has often tended to work towards a degree of abstraction that has rendered it less useful for explaining how economies work, understanding economic problems and crises, and this has adversely affected economics' credibility as a discipline. So these are the main reasons why I would say that the writings of the classical authors from 200 years ago remain relevant today, and students should
Thank you.
care about them. Yeah.
Thank you. So let's just dive right into it. What are the, you've touched upon a little bit, but what are the core ideas of the classical economists?
One core idea was the labor theory of value, which emphasized the amount of labor embodied in a commodity as being the main source of value, and also the conflicting nature of income distribution. Another core idea was that economies can experience economic crises. Classical economists also held the idea that growth and accumulation are very much interrelated with income distribution. Some classical economists did believe in the quantity theory of money, or that money supply is independently set by central banks, but there were also other classical authors who held a real bills doctrine view, which basically believed that the amount of money is fundamentally determined by the level of activity taking place in an economy.
Thank you. We'll be touched on.
If I may say something on that,
Please.
I think it's
Sure.
an important topic. Two things actually. One on the theory of value, because I think the theory of value is something that it's very often not understood. How, whether economists know it or not, they use some theory of value for understanding, almost everything in economics. And at the end of the day, there is some variation of the classical notion. The theory of value is fundamental to understand that distribution is conflictive. And so economists either held some variation of a classical perspective, modified. And so I would suggest, and I'm sure you in your several chapters and discussions have stuff on heterodox economies, post-Keynesians and whatnot. And so many post-Keynesians do hark back. John Robinson did go back and hark back to the ideas of classical authors. And the importance of that is that if you're going to say something about distribution, and distribution being important for accumulation, and that's the reason they delved into the labor into the theory of value, you have to be able to determine, to know what determines the rate of profit. So that was the origin of their preoccupation with a theory of distribution. And of course, if you have to have a theory of the rate of profit, you need to know the relative prices that go into the production of the commodities that will have a uniform rate of profit, and so on and so forth. So that's the basis of why the classical authors thought of that. And I should say the preoccupation with inflation, which is very much with us these days, the classical authors have been in a context that it's absolutely fundamentally connected to a problem of their time. So the Booleanist debate, and I have Ricardo's works there, and I have the 1821. This is the third edition, an actual third edition of Ricardo's principles, which you probably can see. I don't know if can be seen. So Ricardo is discussing the fact that the Bank of England did stop, the convertibility to gold, and in a particular setting from 1797 to 1821, there is no convertibility to the gold standard. Is in that particular context that he defends a view that it's the Booleanist view, is the quantity theory of money. But for the most part, even Ricardo, in a context in which you have convertibility and whatnot, did believe in the real bills doctrine, which I suppose you're going to ask about that, and I'll let Suranjana talk about that and explain what that means.
Thanks. Let me touch on a few things. Yeah, there is a chapter in the book written by me on the post-Keynesians. So a lot of the things that we discussed today will be sort of echoed in a way in that chapter, and also in other chapters as well. But you both mentioned words like income distribution and conflict. I wanted to make clear to the students who are listening and reading your chapter that the classical period was very much based on social classes, which is very different from, what they're usually taught in economics about Homo economicus, about the rational man, etc.
There is no methodological individualism in the classical authors, not even in Smith. Smith is not a methodological individualist author. He's not thinking in terms of rational maximizing man.
So how important was social classes, and what are the implications for looking at society through the lens of social classes?
So if I may say something then, and Suranjana, so I think that the tradition that starts with methodological individualism actually doesn't come from Smith. It comes from Jeremy Bentham and utilitarianism, and pain and pleasure, and that calculus of pain and pleasure is what's behind eventually the rise, starting with Mill, of marginalism and neoclassical economics. There's nothing like that in Smith, certainly not in Ricardo. So they don't think along those lines. They think, as you said, in terms of class, and there is a certain sense of rationality. So the important thing is there is a sense in which the capitalists do want to accumulate. And so they want to obtain profits. It's what Marx had, and and he uses some of the quite a lot of the analytical framework of the classical authors. So he does agree with classical authors on the labor theory of value. He does agree with classical authors on the conflictive nature of distribution and so on and so forth. Where he would, the accumulation is, whatever, it's accumulation, and the profits. I always forget that sort of phrase, but it's a notion that the system is about accumulation. And so this sort of dynamic sense of capitalism is tied to the class conflict of a rising bourgeoisie. So Marx will refer to all of these classical economists as bourgeois economists, the ones that he respects. The ones he doesn't respect and think they're just sycophants of the system, he will call them vulgar economists. So there is a point here in which it is a science of the rising bourgeoisie. It is a science. It's a science of wealth, and it's a science, to use the expressions of Bob Hellbronner's, it's a science of wealth, but it's a science, the worldly philosophy. But it's a science of and hence of class, this particular class that is rising, and it's bringing a new world into fashion, one in which the aristocracy, the landowner interests are seen, at least by some of these authors, as impediment to the process of accumulation of capital.
Yeah, I agree, and thank you very much for that. Suranjana, I want to go back to something you mentioned. You mentioned crises, and that brings up the issue of Say's law. And I wanted to know, what were the classical views, I guess, on Say's law, and whether they agreed with it, whether they disagreed with it, and you mentioned it, if they discussed, or to what degree do they discuss economic crises?
So Say's law is the notion that supply creates its own demand. So in other words, the economic system is supply determined. So anything that isn't consumed is automatically used for investment. And amongst classical authors, there were some classical economists, such as Ricardo, who accepted Say's law and its validity in the long run, even if in the short run supply did not always equal demand. But there were also classical authors, notably Sismondi and Marx, who also did discuss the possibility of economic crises arising in capitalist societies. Sismondi does emphasize that when you have capitalist societies where you have the separation of production from consumption, and you also have inequalities in the distribution of income, the possibility of economic crises arising due to a lack of sufficient demand are possible. Marx also emphasized that when you're talking about advanced capitalist societies, in these societies, one of the main driving motives of production often tends to be accumulation rather than producing for consumption. And capitalists fundamentally produce to accumulate profits not necessarily to cater to consumption. And if it's fundamentally production that's being undertaken with a view to accumulation rather than towards consumption, the possibility of realization crises increase. And you would have situations in which capitalists encounter realization crises and are basically not able to sell everything that they've produced.
Another important point, even in Ricardo, says law does not mean full employment. So there is no notion that the surplus that is left over, the savings, if you want, are gonna, which are by definition. So in the case of Ricardo, it's by definition they are investments. So there is no discussion of a mechanism of how it becomes investment. It's assumed that the only reason for this is that they're going to invest it. And in fact, in the debates with Malthus, Malthus admits that. So I should say that when you think of Malthus as a precursor of Keynesian economics, I think it's problematic, and in the sense that Malthus does not have an answer to that. Malthus does not what Suranjana just explained, the notion that there is a break in the process of, when you go from commodity to money to commodity, the money in the middle may sort of generate the possibility of crisis, and let alone what Suranjana said, that Marx, that says it's about accumulation, so it's money, commodity, money, and then the possibilities of crisis, financial crisis, and cycles, and all of those things sort of become way more important. But Malthus doesn't have that. He admits, he basically accepts the notion that yes, everything that it's saved, it's invested. So it's the Malthusian sort of story for crisis is incoherent. But the point is, at that level of investment, there is no guarantee that the level of employment would be one that would have the labor class fully employed. And so unemployment is not one of the issues that they have in the back of their mind. The level of unemployment corresponds probably to something. They do believe that wages are fixed and they tend to be at subsistence level. And so there might be enough unemployment so as to keep, the wages compressed and repressed at that level. So something that Marx would later call the reserve army. So these ideas are, in a nutshell, going even back. I think we haven't cited the name, but we do in the chapter. Key authors are Petty and and Quesnay and Cantillon, and there is a tradition that goes, I would say, from Petty to Marx that encompasses this sort of framework, analytical framework, what Garagnani calls the surplus approach.
Yeah, exactly. So let me switch a little bit here and go back to something that you've touched on, which is the differences between the quantity theory of money and the real bills doctrine. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Okay. Matías, would you like to answer?
No, by all means.
Okay. So in the quantity theory of money, there's this view that money is, a money supply is exogenously determined by the central bank, and that inflation arises from increases in money supply. But in the real bills doctrine, it's the amount of economic activity that's taking place in the economy, which determines the amount of money that's needed, and money supply is therefore endogenously determined. Also, once we accept that money supply is endogenously determined, it's not possible, as it is in the quantity theory of money, to argue that inflation results from increases in money supply. Rather, inflation would have other sources, such as higher production costs, higher prices that may arise from factors such as particular trade policies. And when you have inflation that arises from these types of monetary factors. An economy is going to need a larger amount of cash balances for financing transactions, which means that money supply will increase because more money is needed for transactions purposes in the economy. So in other words, the increase in money supply would be the result of inflation, not the cause of inflation. So I would say that these are the two major points of differences between the quantity theory of money and the real bills doctrine, if Matías wants to add.
Oh, what I would add is, again, I think it's interesting and good to remember the actual debate in that period. The actual debate in that period corresponds to a great extent to, again, the bullion debate is about the Napoleonic Wars and the crisis in that period. Sorry, I'm going to grab a book. I'm the grabber of old books, and the debate is fundamentally one. If I have to put the two authors, as David Ricardo, certainly the bullionist, and he's thinking here, as I said, an inconvertible system. So he normally would agree. He believes in the labor theory of value. It means that the value of every product depends on the amount of labor needed to produce it. Hence, the value of gold depends on the amount of labor necessary for the production of gold, and hence it's in reverse. It's the value of gold that it's determined by the amounts of labor necessary to produce, and the quantity of gold cannot determine prices. So he does believe in the long run, Ricardo, in a convertible system in the long run, in the real bills doctrine. But in the short run, once you had this sort of inconvertibility, he does think that during the Napoleonic Wars, what caused inflation was the printing of money by the Bank of England. And the key figure, I would say, refuting that view and getting the banner of the real bills doctrine, as Suranjana explained, was Thomas Tuck. Here you have a little pamphlet by Thomas Tuck from 1823. And Tuck is the quintessential sort of classical author defending the real bills doctrine. And what he says is that inflation really during that period is caused by the embargo. So what Suranjana said, what are those trade policies? Napoleonic embargo. So they cannot import corn. They're forced to use lands of lower quality, diminishing returns in agriculture within an island. So not the diminishing returns that will come in neoclassical economics that are generalized. This is in agriculture because of a natural phenomenon, fertility, that in the short run cannot be sort of changed by significant changes in productivity. So prices, the price of what? The price of the corn, the wheat that it's consumed by workers goes up. And so that is what sort of pushes prices up. And so it is a cost push sort of story of inflation. I would say and I'm going to get a little bit out of bounds here and say something that would come later in post-Keynesian and Latin American structuralist views. There is in classical authors, as we said, a notion that conflict is central for distribution. There is no clear discussion of conflictive inflation. With John Robinson, that idea will appear. So the idea that inflation is fundamentally about distributive conflict. And so it's not just that normally it's cost push rather than demand pull, it could be, but that it's also sustained by distributive conflict. So by groups, social groups not being satisfied with their shares in income. And I think that that's also an important sort of element to understand, the current inflationary process, or whether they will be sustained or not, and that kind of stuff. So all of that, again, it's going back to your first question, why classical authors remain relevant.
Well, thank you. And what I took from this discussion.
Oh, I see what you did there.
But it's a good segue into the last question, which is sort of going back to the first. Is it still relevant today? And I was listening to you, Suranjana, and to you, Matías, and I had to keep telling myself, oh wait, they're not talking about today. They're talking about the classical period. But it goes to show how relevant it still is today. And especially in, social classes, conflict, income distribution, which for me anyways, are perhaps three of the main, maybe, they're the same, but element in economics today. And this is something we certainly owe to the classical authors. Well, thank you very much. This has been a very good discussion. I very much enjoyed it. Thank you, Suranjana. Thank you, Matías. And thank you for contributing to the book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.